morning, Mr. McSporran.
Morning, my lord.
Would you take the oath? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. McSporran.
Morning, ma'am.
You are John McSporran.
Yes,
What age are you?
I'm 65.
And to go just through some of your background experience, you joined the police in 1982.
Yes,
You've given a detailed history of your career in paragraph 1 of your inquiry statement
yes,
that we'll come to in a moment, and the chair can reflect on that at some point. I think by about 1992 you were a sergeant and then a detective sergeant in Glasgow.
yes,
In 1996 you joined Special Branch.
yes,
In 2000 you were promoted to Detective Inspector in charge of Scotland's police counter-terrorism surveillance capability and led surveillance operations.
yes,
In 2004 you were promoted to Detective Chief Inspector in charge of Special Branch.
Special Branch Special Operations.
You were then seconded in work for the UK government to work in Africa, and in early 2005 you were posted to Sierra Leone.
Yes,
And in 2006 you returned from Sierra Leone and you were promoted to Detective Superintendent in charge of CID in Ayrshire Division.
yes,
And that included, as I understand it, being SIO in murder investigations.
yes,
You had completed the SIO course and the Review of Major Investigations course.
yes,
You were later transferred to take charge of covert special operations targeting terrorist and organised crime groups and supporting murder investigations.
yes,
You were a tactical firearms commander and you were policy lead for UK policing on data communications.
yes,
And you also undertook sensitive inquiries directed by the Crown Office into allegations of racism and religious abuse by members of football clubs.
yes,
You have been involved with inquiries into allegations of racism.
yes,
In 2009, you were transferred to take charge of what was then a newly established major investigations team, and you were SIO in Category A murder inquiries and complex crimes.
yes,
And you retired from the police in 2012,
yes,
and then you were recruited along with another to the Police Complaints Commission Scotland, and that was the predecessor to PIRC.
yes,
PIRC it was created on the 1st of April 2013.
that's correct.
Now, have you had the chance to watch any of the other evidence in the inquiry at all?
I have.
So you'll know that in front of you there should be a folder, and this contains a number of documents, including in statements and such like. If you prefer to use hard copies, those are there and available for you. But my plan today is to put things on the screen in front of you, and as we're going through pages of documents, they will be on the screen, and if you're happy to do so, you can simply look at the screen and I'll ask you questions in relation to what we see.
Thank you, ma'am.
If there is anything that you think we should have or we should have available, we'll try and find it. If there's an issue with that or we can't immediately lay our hands on it, we'll be able to get it at the next break. So if there's anything that you're aware of that you think might help us understand the position, please let me know and we'll do our best to get that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Can I ask first of all if we could maybe put your inquiry statement onto the screen, and you'll see this. This is actually a written response prepared by you in relation to what's known as a Rule 8 request from the inquiry team.
That's correct.
But to make it easier for me primarily, I'm calling these inquiry statements, and this is your inquiry statement, if I can call it that.
Yes, ma'am.
So your name's at the top, and it's 57 pages long, and it's been signed by you on every page. Is that correct?
That's correct, ma'am.
Now, if we look at the last page, we'll see that it was signed on the 16th of August 2023. Your signature is redacted. You can see it on the screen. We have the final page on the screen now. So you can see that signed on the 16th of August.
Yes, ma'am.
We've redacted your signature, but the copy that you've just looked at has your actual signature showing on it.
That's correct, ma'am.
Now, just above that signature, there's a paragraph that says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And you knew that when you signed it.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, as we mentioned a moment ago, you retired in 2012 and were recruited by the then PCCS and then joined PIRC, or when it became PIRC, you were part of it on the 1st of April 2013.
Yes.
How soon after you retired from the police did you join PCCS?
Approximately 3 months.
There's other evidence available to the chair that a number of people were employed prior to PIRC formally commencing, and part of their role was to help set things up and get the team established. Was that part of what you were doing at the time?
Yes, initially there was only one person to set up investigations. That was Mr. John Mitchell, who I understand you will see later. I was the second person recruited to do that.
Now, sometimes with the microphones, they are not as loud. Now, perhaps the person sitting next to you could assist and maybe bring that slightly closer, and we'll see if that helps, because you're quite quietly spoken and everyone in the room needs to...
Yes, sorry.
Oh, that's a lot better. That's perfect. Good. So we may be hearing from Mr. Mitchell later in the inquiry that he helped set up. And was he there when you joined?
Yes.
Thank you. And I think in your inquiry statement you say that PIRC were funded by the Scottish Government.
Yes.
And there was sufficient monies to set up a team, to recruit a team of investigators, and that there were around 20 people or so to cover Scotland.
Initially there was 20 investigators, a head of investigations who was Irene Scullion, and a director of investigations, John Mitchell. So 22 in all, but the investigations were 20 people.
And this was a new team. The investigations was then brought in to a new organisation called PIRC.
Yes.
And as I understand it, that was partly to take account of Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights.
Yes, I think I mentioned it in my statement that, and you went over it previously during the inquiry, the 5 principles for independent investigation when Article 2 and Article 3 are engaged.
Thank you. We'll come on to that again. And then, as I understand it, you were initially a senior investigator with PIRC.
Yes.
We've already heard evidence from Mr. Keith Harrower and Mr. Billy Little, who were deputy senior investigators.
Yes.
And they've said that you were more senior than they were.
Yes, initially there was 2 senior investigators, myself and I think it's been mentioned before, Mr. Casey.
Yes, we've heard about Richard Casey, I think known as Ricky.
Yeah.
And then since 2017, am I correct in saying you've been their head of investigations?
Yes, since 2017. I retired on 31st of August last year.
Right. So you were head of investigations from 2017 up until the end of August last year.
Yes.
And you're now retired.
Yes.
Thank you. And I think in your inquiry statement you say, in your role within PIRC, you have directed or overseen over 200 death investigations.
Yes, I did the maths when I committed it to paper, so overall 271 death investigations.
Is there a distinction between directed and overseeing that you could explain to us?
Yes, so there's two types of death investigations. There's Crown instructed death investigation and there's a police referred death investigation. So if Crown instructs, we must investigate. If police refer, we don't necessarily have to investigate. It will be dependent on the circumstances. So in a police referred one, you will do an assessment to determine whether you need to investigate or are required to investigate. So the number of investigations or number of referrals does not necessarily equate to the number of actual investigations because of that assessment process. So when the referral comes in, you will assess it, you will ask for additional material, potentially statements, etc., to undertake that assessment to decide whether you are going to investigate it. So that's the assessment phase, and I was engaged in most assessments or the signing off of a lot of assessments. Equally, I would take part in the investigation or I would lead the investigation. So there's various stages across that. That's why 271 sounds a large number, but the actual number of investigations would be less than that.
Of the 271, how many were Crown-led investigations, which had to be investigations, and how many were referrals from the Chief Constable?
That varies. Initially, there were more referrals from the police. Now I think the majority tend to be Crown directed. Equally, where we get a referral in from the police and we think that it should be investigated, what we may do is actually notify Crown and see whether they then wish to direct. If they don't, we can proceed to investigate anyway, but a Crown direction always trumps a police referred investigation.
And if the Crown send you an instruction, you have to investigate?
Yes.
So of those 271 referrals or investigations, how many were actual investigations that you were involved in?
I can't say precisely. What I did do in the preparation of my related statement was examine how many I had been involved in since PIRC came into being on the 1st of April 2013 up to the 5th of May, the date of Mr. Bio's death. And I think there was about just over 50. That's assessments, referrals and investigations. The actual number of investigations that I've been involved in up to that point was 22 death investigations.
And of those 22 death investigations that you were involved in, how many involved deaths in police custody or deaths following police contact?
I don't think I broke it down in my related statement, so I couldn't give you a precise number. Deaths in custody are twofold, so you've got what most people would understand as a death in a police cell, and then as soon as somebody's arrested or restrained or whatever, they are actually in effect in custody, and therefore if that person dies, that's a death in custody, and then you get death following police contact. So I don't think I broke it down, and I didn't undertake that analysis when preparing my related statement.
I appreciate you can't give us a precise figure. From your recollection now, are you able to give us an indication?
Probably half and half, about 50-50. That's a rough estimate.
So of the 22 deaths, about half were deaths in custody?
Yes.
And half were deaths following police contact?
Yes.
And as you've said, were some deaths in cells?
Some deaths are in cells, but it's considered as soon as a person is arrested or restrained, they're actually in custody. They're no longer free to go about their business. So that's the definition of in custody. Therefore, if the person then dies, that's a death in custody.
So if around 11 were deaths in custody or thereabouts,
Yes.
can you, again reflecting back, indicate how many were deaths in cells and how many were not?
That varies year on year. Some years you can get 4 deaths in police cells. Some years you might just get 1. Going back to 2013, 14, 15, I couldn't give you a precise number.
Do you have an impression now of whether there were more deaths in cells than deaths during a restraint or involving officers?
I think certainly things have progressed and advanced. That's one of the roles of PIRC, is to identify challenges, procedural problems where things can be improved, and to make recommendations to the police. Some of that may arise from the investigation of deaths in custody. So for example, high-risk prisoners are put in constant observations. We've made a number of recommendations to improve how constant observations are undertaken, so that the officers doing the constant obs don't miss something and place the person at increased risk because they are a high-risk prisoner. So that's part of the role of PIRC, is learning and improvement, and also making recommendations to Police Scotland so that they can develop and improve and lessen the risk that these things happen.
So in that period between the 1st of April 2013, when PIRC was created officially, and the 3rd of May 2015, so in that period prior to the death of Mr. Bio, can you help us understand how many involved deaths where the police were involved in a restraint that you'd been involved in?
I can't give you a precise figure. I think part of the challenge when I was doing my Rule 8 statement was going back over the statistics, and a lot of the statistics from that period, the numbers existed, but the actual circumstances were no longer recorded, and that's the difficulty I have in being precise about this.
Right, all right, thank you. But you were involved with the investigation into the death of Mr. Bio.
Yes.
You were also involved in, at a later date, into the fatal shooting of an asylum seeker in the hotel in Glasgow.
Yes.
And you've been involved in other major PIRC investigations, you've said.
Yes, ma'am.
And your statement indicates you were a trained post-incident manager.
Yes.
Was that prior to May 2015 or after?
Prior to it.
And we've heard that some of the PIRC investigators were what they call PIM aware, but you were actually a trained post-incident manager yourself.
Yes, I went down to an English force, from memory I think it was Bedfordshire. What between PIRC and Police Scotland, who run the PIM course, we organised 1 day's training for PIRC investigators to raise their awareness of the post-incident procedures, the PIM process.
And you've attended numerous post-incident procedures following deaths in custody, you've said.
Yeah, deaths in custody, deaths following police contact, fatal shootings, other police shootings.
Thank you. And then you've also told us that you were asked to undertake a review of what is now the IOPC in England and Wales, and you also investigated the Hillsborough inquiry.
The IOPC, or the IPCC as it was at the time, asked PIRC to undertake a review of their Hillsborough investigation to see what lessons or improvements could be made. So myself, John Mitchell, Brian Dodd and I think Billy Little we went down. I authored the report, which was submitted to the IPCC, now the IOPCC, identifying various or providing recommendations for areas that they may wish to consider to improve the investigation.
Do you recall when that was?
I have in my head it was 2014, but it might have been 2014, 2016, around about that time period.
Was it before or after Mr. Bio's death?
I can't recall.
So I'd like to ask you about 3 documents, and you've mentioned Article 2 and the importance of that to PIRC.
Yeah.
I'd like to look at 3 documents which I've referred Mr. Harrower and Mr. Little to, so you probably have seen me do that.
Yes, ma'am.
And these will come up on the screen. The first is PIRC 04446. Now you'll see that this is dated 12th of November 2012. And it's entitled Police Investigations and Review Commissioner, Operational Model, Response to Article 2 Investigations.
Yes,
And now, do you recognise that document?
I do.
And was this a document that was in place by the creation of PIRC in April 2013?
Yes.
And had you had any training or guidance in relation to this document?
Not so much training or guidance, but certainly I'd read the document, also researched stated cases by the European Court in relation to Article 2 and Article 3 matters.
Thank you. And just in general, what was the importance of Article 2 to PIRC?
I think it's one of our primary functions, because I have been, as you're well aware, ma'am, more schooled in the law than I am, but since 2007 and before that, there's been decisions by the European Court that the police cannot investigate themselves in respect of a death in police custody or death following police contact. That investigation needs to be independent, effective. I think the key decision was, from memory, Ramsey versus Netherlands in 2007. In 2009, you had decisions by the European Commission for Human Rights in respect of Article 3 investigations. And then in 2010, you had the paper that you've referred to throughout this inquiry, the recommendations and the 5 principles from the European Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you. Let's go on to it's page 2, paragraph 5 I'm interested in. We've heard some evidence about this document, so I won't take you to every paragraph, but you'll see paragraph 5 says, the Human Rights Act 1998 and obligations imposed under Article 2 apply equally to the Police, Crown Office and PIRC. Where Article 2 is engaged, the police service have a duty to ensure that they conduct themselves in a manner that is consistent with the 5 procedural obligations that the courts have held to exist. And these are then listed in bullet points. And the first is the investigation must be independent, insofar as it should have no hierarchical or institutional connection to those implicated.
Yes.
And the second is the investigation must be effective. Now these are in bold in this document.
Yes.
And you'll see that in the paragraph under it says, so far as this document is concerned, it is the first 2 obligations that are relevant and which must be observed by the police and PIRC under direction of the Crown. And we've heard that those were very significant obligations on PIRC, but that wasn't to say the other 3 should be ignored.
No.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. Part of it, if we look at the 4th bullet point, there must be a sufficient element of public scrutiny. Of course, in respect of a Crown-directed investigation, we refer all matters to Crown. We don't publish those details. So that's the restriction there. If it's a police referred matter, we can publish. And involvement in the next of kin, that's key.
Right. And why do you say that's key? Because obviously I didn't read the final three. The investigation must be reasonably prompt, there must be a sufficient element of public scrutiny, and it says the next of kin must be involved to an appropriate extent. Why do you say that's key?
Because they are the relatives of the deceased. Invariably they're traumatised by the death, hugely upset, and you need to involve them, you need to inform them. That's why we have the whole family liaison officers to support the family of the deceased. That is key.
Thank you. Can we look at page 8 now, just very briefly? And we see here additional advice for staff. This is in a section called PIRC Investigators Guidance Note, Referrals Involving the Police Use of Firearms. And page 8 says, if the indications are that the guidance is not going to be complied with, we should explain to officers that in relation to the use of lethal force, they should record their honestly held belief why they use the force, and we should make it clear that conferring is not necessary when recording their own belief. We must be clear that we are not seeking for officers to be separated, and we understand that they're entitled to legal advice. There's a few matters there.
Yes, that's largely coming from the PIM process.
Right. And we've asked some witnesses about what happened to the officers on the 3rd of May 2015. They were taken back to the canteen at Kirkcaldy Police Office, but not separated. And there's some guidance within this document about conferring and separation.
Yes, the officers. There has been a debate, particularly in England and Wales, about separating officers following death in custody fatal shootings. However, I think it's been held that it is very much a matter for the police, as long as there are processes in place to ensure that the officers don't confer and they are given the warning against conferring, and you're ensuring that integrity of the process, that you don't leave them alone so they've got the opportunity. And that's part of the PIP process, which is, it's a police process, but you have the post-incident manager, you have their deputy, you've got support staff or other officers that come in. I've been involved in, well, you mentioned the fatal shooting of the asylum seeker in the hotel in Glasgow. In that case, we had 53 key police witnesses. So you've got to find accommodation for them. You need multiple PIMs and support staff. You need multiple PIRC investigation teams. And right up front, they should be given the warning against conferring. Sometimes that warning might be broadcast over the radio. Sometimes if we're travelling a distance to, so for example, there was a shooting in Inverness. I was travelling up to Inverness. I spoke to the post-incident manager. I said, have you given the warning against conferring yet? Not yet. Do it. Get it done over the radio, because the officers were in different stations, and record the fact that it's done.
Right. And there's a recognition in that paragraph that it says we must be clear that we're not seeking for officers to be separated. We understand that they're entitled to legal advice.
Yes, legal advice is part of the PIM process, should they require it.
And PIM recognise that that's an option for officers who may wish to take legal advice.
Yes, I've been to, I think sometimes PIP and PIM become interchangeable. So PIP is the process, post-incident procedures. PIM is the post-incident manager. But sometimes people think it's post-incident management. So it's interchangeable sometimes. So I've been to post-incident procedures following deaths where the officers didn't require and didn't seek legal advice. Equally, I've been to post-incident procedures where the officers did seek legal advice. It's very much a matter for the officers themselves to decide. Right.
It then goes on to say each case will have to be dealt with on its own merits. The underlying principle will be to ensure that our investigation is as effective as it possibly can be. And that's one of the 5 principles that you want to carry out.
Yes.
Not just an independent investigation, but also effective or adequate in
Yes.
its conclusion. If investigators are confronted with an unwillingness to comply, the relevant senior PIRC representative should be consulted. So there is a recognition that there might be some unwillingness on the part of officers, but the senior PIRC representative should be consulted.
Yes. The only example we have is the case of Mr. Bio's death. In all other cases we've been involved in, the officers have always given initial accounts or detailed statements. This is the only one that has not happened.
Right. And is that your experience throughout your career?
Yes.
We've heard that the PIP, the process, envisages different steps and procedure, and one of them is initial basic facts,
Yeah.
then initial accounts, and then a more detailed statement, which can be taken around 48 hours later after the event.
Yeah, and I think that comes from studies to show that when you have a critical incident, when you are involved in, let's say, a fatal shooting or something like that, to a certain extent, sometimes you get tunnel vision because you're focusing on the emergency in front of you, and your memory immediately after that is just in the focus of that critical area. But I think studies have shown that with the passage of 48 hours, a lot of the memory of other events comes back, and that's why you want the detailed statement 48 hours later. The initial account is very much to allow the progress of the investigation. So the first thing is you've got the SITREP, that's stage 1.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
SITREP, situation report.
Right.
A lot of times that is from the storm log, and I think we've heard about storm logs.
Yes.
So that's the situation report, and the PIM will obtain that. Next thing is a PIM basic facts. So the post-incident manager will get an account from one of the officers, preferably not the key officer that was involved in the use of force or the discharge of firearms, but one of the other officers, trying to get basic facts as to what occurred. And then initial accounts from the officers or staff. And the initial accounts are just very brief, usually no more than 1 or 2 pages, just about, for example, I went, I saw, I did, and this is my honestly held belief of my reason to use force, of the necessity to use force. And it's as basic as that. And that then gets passed to, for example, ourselves to allow us to progress the investigation. Therefore, we have an understanding broadly of what's occurred, and that gets handed to us. And then, with the passage of 48 hours, the officers supply what they call their stage 4 accounts, which is their detailed accounts.
Thank you. So, going back for a moment to basic facts, you said it wouldn't be the officers directly involved. Could that be, for example, the police sergeant in charge of the response team, who go and maybe it's the response team members who carry out a restraint or use force, but he was not directly involved with the restraint and the use of force?
Yes, so broadly, if somebody is hands-on, for want of a better expression, or the person that has discharged the shots, the fatal shots, etc., you want somebody that has not been hands-on or discharged the fatal shots. And that usually comes from one of the other officers that's been there and has observed what's happened.
So someone who was maybe standing by and observing, but not directly involved with what's going on in relation to the incident's
Yes.
force. And initial accounts, would the process envisage that they would be taken from all the officers involved?
Initial accounts are usually obtained from what they term key police witnesses, so that's officers that are directly involved in the incident. An officer that's not directly involved but may have played a peripheral role, they are not held to be a key police witness, they are not part of the PIP process, therefore operational statements could be requested from them immediately, and that would be full operational statements.
So in this scenario involving Mr. Bile, we've heard that there were 9 officers attended the scene, but we also heard about other officers who arrived slightly later, towards the end of the incident. One was a detective sergeant and one was a detective constable.
Yes.
And so they were at the scene, but not directly involved with the restraint itself.
I think also Sergeant Maxwell, who turned up, he was the shift sergeant, temporary Sergeant Maxwell as he was at the time, but he didn't go hands-on. Therefore, preferable, because the 2 detectives that turned up didn't see the initial, what had happened. They turned up slightly afterwards. So potentially Sergeant Maxwell would be the best place to provide that, the basic facts, because from my recollection, 6 officers went hands-on with Mr. Bio. You had PC shot, injured and going to hospital. So probably Sergeant Maxwell would be the best person to give the PIM basic facts, or to obtain the PIM basic facts from.
And in terms of initial accounts, key officers, would that be the officers involved in the restraint?
Yes.
Right. And then detailed accounts or statements from everyone present, would that be envisaged at 48 hours?
Yes. So of the 9 principal officers, you would expect detailed statements within, with the passage of 48 hours. DC Connell and DS
Davidson?
Samantha Davidson, I think they gave accounts, detailed accounts, shortly thereafter, because I'm aware DC Connell provided a statement to us. I think his statement was dated the 4th, so that's the next day, and he's the one that actually recovered the knife. But he hadn't been hands-on or involved in the restraint or the incident, therefore he provided an operational statement. Now, I don't know what his inquiry reference number is, but from memory it was statement 22A taken by PIRC during the course of the bio investigation.
We have those numbers, but we use our own numbers,
Yes,
unfortunately.
so.
Thank you. Let's move on from that document that we see on the screen, and I'd like you to refer you to another document, please. And this is a Memorandum of Understanding, which is PIRC 04453. Now, if we can move up the page, we see Memorandum of Understanding between Crown Office and PIRC. And if we go to the very end of this document, first of all, sorry, there are appendices at the rear, so if we can move back up, please. There we are, and we'll see that this document was signed. This actual signatures are redacted, but it was signed for PIRC on the 10th of December 2015, and 13, and signed on behalf of the Crown Office on the 11th of December 2013. So this document had been signed and agreed prior to the events in May 2015.
Yes, it's been revised a few times and developed as familiarity with PIRC and our role has expanded, so it's been revised over a few times.
We understand this is the document that was
In force at the time.
In May 2015.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's go to the top. We noticed the first page. If we could start looking at the next section. Yes, Memorandum of Understanding. And you'll see on page 2, which we're on, if we move down, it's role of Crown Office, and then it says PIRC statutory responsibilities. And I think you've spent some time in your inquiry statement explaining the statutory responsibilities and how the statute worked in practice.
Yes, the legislation, I think, as I've said later on in my ruling statement, is incredibly complex and not easily understood. And as you're aware, dependent on the nature of the referral to PIRC, if it comes from Crown, we have certain powers. If it comes from the police, we have slightly different powers. And it's difficult to disentangle all this because it is really quite complex.
And we see at the bottom of that page, if we can just move down slightly, you can see that we've heard that there can be referrals from the Chief Constable.
Yes.
And there are Crown-led investigations.
Yes.
And we can see here, sorry, if we can just see the numbers. It's section 2.1 of this document, and it refers to section 33A of the 2006 Act. And if we look at B, this relates to where PIRC's directed by the appropriate prosecutor. So this would be the Crown-led element of the statute.
Yes.
And there are two paragraphs. The first we can see here, which is B1, to investigate any circumstances in which there is an indication that a person serving with the police may have committed an offence. And I think that's what other witnesses have described as investigating alleged criminal allegations or a potential crime.
That's right.
So that's Crown-led into a potential crime.
Yes.
And then B2, which others have referred to, is about investigating the circumstances of any death involving a person serving with the police. And that's an investigation into circumstances of a death.
Yes.
Where there's been police involvement.
Yes.
So B1 is the criminal allegations and B2 is investigating circumstances.
Yes.
And I think you've spent time explaining that in your statement.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So again, you're familiar with this document, are you?
Yes.
And again, was this something that was trained to PIRC investigators when this document came into force, or is it something that you were expected to read and understand?
I'm not sure whether it was trained, but certainly staff were informed of it. They were expected to read it. It is the basis of our agreement between PIRC and Crown. Also, to a certain extent, it explains the legislation. The different types of investigation we do, so investigative staff would need to be aware.
Yeah. And if we can have a look at page 4, section 5.1. This sets out the role of PIRC in investigations and talks about the different powers, and 5.2 makes it clear that during the course of an investigation, PIRC investigators have the powers of a constable.
Yes.
But we've heard that unlike a constable, those powers will end at the end of the working day.
Yes.
And it sets out that 5.3 that PIRC is independent from any policing body operating within Scotland.
Yes.
And I think Mr. Little gave evidence that it's not just Police Scotland that you are potentially investigating. There's other bodies that you could investigate.
That's correct. So Ministry of Defence Police, British Transport Police, Civil Nuclear Constabulary, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, Borders, Immigration. Anybody that really has sort of enforcement or policing powers comes under the remit of PIRC in Scotland. So you've got these national agencies, National Crime Agency for example, they're operating both sides of the border, but if the incident happens in Scotland, to do with these agencies, PIRC investigates. If the incident happens in England or Wales, then it is the IOPC that investigates.
Thank you. And then 5.4. In order to provide effective investigations, particularly those requiring specialist skills, the PIRC may second officers or members of staff from police forces operating in Scotland or elsewhere within the UK. Officers on secondment will be directly supervised and instructed by senior PIRC investigators during the course of investigations. Any decision to second specialists will require careful consideration about independence, in particular in relation to obligations under ECHR Article 2 and 3 investigations.
Yes.
And so we've heard that it's envisaged that PIRC may not have all the skills that are required in any individual investigation, but you have the authority to second the people that do have the skills.
We have never seconded anybody to ourselves from a policing body. When we were setting up PIRC, we certainly had a seconded officer, but that officer's secondment ceased before PIRC came into being. But we've never seconded anybody because, as you point out here, there is potential, particularly because it's, the largest policing body in Scotland is Police Scotland. And therefore, when it's an Article 2 matter, potentially there's a real conflict there seconding people from Police Scotland to PIRC. What we can do is direct them to undertake certain functions on our behalf, particularly you've got the geographic nature of Scotland, and PIRC covers the whole of Scotland 24/7, 365. We've had incidents happening in the Orkney Islands, in the Shetland Islands, the Outer Hebrides, Thurso, Inverness. It's going to take us a number of hours or a day to get to those locations. Therefore, you can't simply freeze everything. You may have to task people in Police Scotland, so for example, scene managers, various other specialists, to undertake functions on your behalf. You will examine what they've done once you get there to make sure that they've ticked all the right boxes. Certainly, a few times when we are travelling to an incident, you're speaking to the specialists and saying, look, have you done this, have you done that, can you do this on our behalf? Because you simply can't hit the pause button due to the practicalities until we get there. So we can direct them to undertake functions on our behalf, and we can then check that they have done that effectively.
So you or PIRC can take steps to preserve the evidence in relation to any aspect of an investigation pending your arrival, depending on the geographical limitations?
Yes. If it's a death in custody in a police cell, you can just lock down that cell. We have had before where we've locked down an entire wing of a cell block. But if the death in custody occurs outside, in the street, for example, the practicalities of freezing everything at that point just don't exist. You've got a person's dead in the street. You're not going to wait 5, 6, 7, 8 hours for us to turn up. You need to move on that. Equally, if there's evidence lying around, sometimes it's practical to protect it by putting a cordon round the scene, but equally you've got to take into account weather conditions. If you take, for example, the death of Mr. Bio, that Sunday morning it was raining heavily. So the practicalities of protecting a scene when you've got inclement weather, you've really got to move quite quick on it, and we will then come along later on and just check what they have done.
Is there an expectation in the situation you're describing that police officers will preserve the evidence in a forensic way, or that they will install tents over items, or do you have any direction to provide in relation to that?
We do have some direction. I'll go back to an example we touched on earlier, which was the fatal shooting of the asylum seeker in the hotel in Glasgow. After the shooting occurred, his body was taken out. It was taken to a bus stop, effectively, where they tried medical intervention to save his life. That failed, and that area was then protected until ourselves and Police Scotland scene managers could get to it, and the body then got transported to the mortuary. So sometimes it's practical to do it, other times it's not practical.
And in terms of directing the way that a scene is preserved, is that something that PIRC have input into?
Yes. Sometimes scenes can be quite complex. And there can be, I don't know whether it's the right choice of phrase, the division of the spoils. So, for example, and I'll go back to the shooting of the asylum seeker in the hotel in Glasgow, he had stabbed 5 people up to that point. Now, we can't investigate the actions, his actions in stabbing those persons. That's an inquiry for Police Scotland. Police Scotland then discharged taser and discharged firearms. We can investigate those incidents because we're investigating the actions of the officers. But frequently what you've got is like Joe's, sorry about that, I keep hitting
Not
that.
at all.
I speak with my hands, so forgive me. But sometimes those scenes are like dual scenes, so we're investigating one aspect of what happened at that scene and the police might be investigating another aspect. So what you've got to do is get the scene managers to coordinate and sometimes prioritise who's doing what first to achieve the best outcome.
So there can be parallel investigations, if you like, going on at one scene.
Yes.
One aspect being investigated by the police, the other aspect being investigated by PIRC.
Yes. And that happens more than you would think. There was a shooting up in Inverness. I think it's the whole thing's concluded now. The person's been not so much found guilty, but remanded to the state hospital. But you have a whole series of incidents leading up to the shooting by the police. So the police will investigate the series of incidents leading up to it, and we'll investigate the shooting. But both occurred at the same location, so you've got a dual location to examine.
And does that involve communication, effective communication between the police and PIRC in those situations?
Yes.
Can I go back to the paragraph we were looking at, 5.4? You said that PIRC have never seconded anyone, but we've also heard that PIRC may require to rely on support from Police Scotland officers. And you've talked about a scenario where geographically PIRC are going to take some time to arrive at a scene and officers will assist in preserving the evidence at that scene.
Yes.
Now, can you explain a little about the rationale between the difference between seconding someone to PIRC, which has never been done, and there are concerns about independence, but relying on the support of police officers?
I think because you are then checking their work. So you have, particularly out with officers, for want of a better expression, we have small teams of on-call. Therefore, you don't have all the specialisms. Therefore, you're asking for the assistance for Police Scotland to deploy some of their specialists. But you're then checking their work. You might be speaking to them as you're travelling towards that location. When you get there, you say, what have you done? Well, I've done X, Y, Z. Okay, can you also do A, B and C? So you are checking that work and making sure that they've completed that task. You would certainly not be asking one of the principal officers involved to do anything like that. It would be staff brought in that were not involved in the incident itself.
And would that be for a minimum period or a distinct task rather than bringing them into PIRC on secondment?
You wouldn't bring them in and second them. Usually it is within the first 24, 48 hours they're doing those tasks on our behalf because we simply don't have the resources. We need to muster the resources. We need to get them to the location. There's a lot of logistics involved. So if you're going up to Inverness for a large-scale inquiry, you simply just don't go. If you know it, then it's like, well, we need to book hotels, we need additional vehicles, staff need to change of clothes. There's logistics involved in trying to achieve that, which is also another factor that comes into play. Sometimes you might be on the road and you just, right, fine, I'm going, and you'll travel, and it might take you 3-4 hours to get there. You then might manage the initial response or oversee what the police are doing, knowing that the next morning you're going to have additional officers, additional PIRC staff in who have those specialisms. So you're trying to manage that in that interim period by gaining assistance from specialists within the police.
So is it envisaged that although you may require to initially rely on support from the police, whether managing the scene or holding the fort, if you like, until PIRC arrive, is that seen as a temporary arrangement, temporary support from Police Scotland?
In most instances, yes. That's why PIRC has employed people with various specialisms, so his previous experience in scene management. You spoke to Mr. Lewis. He worked in roads policing. He was involved in road crash and death investigations in that regard. People with firearms experience, people with experience in custody, family liaison, so people with those experiences. But we don't have all the specialisms. It's a small organisation, so for example, we can't undertake cyber matters. We just don't have that capability, so you will rely on cybercrime at Police Scotland, because you simply don't have those specialisms. We're not large enough, and we're not funded to do that.
Any other areas where you don't have specialist staff to assist?
I think because of our restricted role in undertaking death investigations or other such things, most of the specialisms that we require, we have. There's also diverse specialisms within the police that are, because they've got so many other purposes other than PIRC. Therefore, they have a lot of additional specialists, and that we may never get involved in that type of investigation. So we focus on the key areas that matter to ourselves, which is the ones I've highlighted.
Right, thank you. And then going back to this memorandum, do you see 5.5 on the screen? It says PIRC investigations are intended to comply with the 5 principles of effective investigation outlined by ECHR, namely independence, adequacy, promptness, and so far as possible, public scrutiny and victim involvement.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
again, this is mirroring the previous document we looked at with the 5 principles.
Yes.
And so that's integral to the work of PIRC and the investigations that are carried out.
Yes.
Is that something that's trained to staff when they join PIRC?
I don't know whether you would actually call it trained to staff, because we have an induction process for all new staff, but that's largely to teach them the way PIRC operates, HR, all that sort of stuff. But as they join investigations, if they do not have previous experience, certainly we walk them through our processes and the reasons for it. A lot of it becomes on-the-job training, but they certainly become aware of it very quickly.
All right. Thank you. Can I ask you to look at a third document now, please, which is PIRC 04438. And there's no date on this actual document. It's not signed, but the inquiry's been advised by PIRC that this was dated 17th of June 2014. So prior to Mr. Bio's death and after PIRC had been created. You'll see on page 1, this paper was designed to take cognizance of the report by His Honour Judge Keith Cutler, Assistant Coroner, on the 29th of May 2014 in respect of the shooting of Mark Duggan by the Metropolitan Police. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recognise this document?
I think so. I don't know who authored it. It might even have been me. I did it.
All right.
Because
Well,
certainly I was aware of the Duggan thing, and I had researched the decision in the Duggan. I can't remember who drafted it, but I certainly wrote quite a few of these. Whether I wrote this one, I don't remember, but I certainly remember this report itself.
Excellent. So there's been a number of concerns raised by the IPCC, and it says in the final sentence, the purpose of this document is to identify learning opportunities and give clear guidance of what is expected of the PIRC investigation team following such a shooting by officers of Police Scotland. And so this was a document designed to identify learning opportunities and give guidance. Was that something that was done in PIRC before May 2015? Documents were prepared for that purpose?
Yes, because sometimes I think we described it as learning the lessons. So if there was a significant case from England and Wales that could potentially occur in Scotland, we would learn those lessons and we would cascade some of that learning. But equally, there was the transition to post-incident procedures which prior to 2014, 2015 were solely for firearms incidents in Scotland. There was that gradual transition to them now being applied to potentially any serious incident, particularly a death. So I think the first time it was used, or attempted to be used, was in relation to Mr. Bio's death. But prior to that, it was only for police shootings.
Right, thank you. And the next section is investigative function. And again, this talks about the initial stages after the discharge of a police firearm. And it says, Police Scotland must, in line with the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 2, take all appropriate steps to reduce any possible risks of the investigation being undermined by deficiencies, such as failing to secure all available evidence. Then it says the responsibility for securing evidence and taking appropriate action in Article 2 investigation remains with Police Scotland until such time as PIRC has taken over conduct of the investigation. And is that what you were talking about a moment ago?
Yes.
Where police continue to preserve a scene for the purposes of preserving the best evidence until PIRC arrive in the location and are able to take control?
Yes. Sometimes if you've got complex scenes, you lock down the scene. You will ask that police officers stand by on the cordon, lock it down where potentially possible. So again, I'll use the example of the fatal shooting in the hotel in Glasgow. That scene was locked down because it was going to be a complex scene to examine. We had to cut walls apart, trying to recover bullets, etc. So there's a whole range of complexities and that could take place over a number of days. So if you can lock it down and secure it, sometimes that's the best approach. Sometimes it's not always possible.
I'm interested in this phrase, until such time as the PIRC has taken over conduct of the investigation. Is that point where PIRC take over conduct of the investigation, is that from the moment PIRC receive the call from Crown Office saying do a Crown-led investigation, or is it from the point that PIRC arrive at the scene?
No, it's from the point that we get the instruction from Crown. Right. Equally, if we go into the practicalities, sometimes what will happen is the police will refer a death or serious incident to PIRC. We might examine it, we might notify Crown, and Crown say, fine, we're now directing you to investigate. Equally, we might go back to police and say, well, Crown are not directing us, but we've decided to investigate. So it's at the point of notification to the police, not at the point of our arrival, at the point of notification. This is now a PIRC investigation.
And that's in a referral scenario. In a Crown-led investigation, is it the point at which the Crown sends you the instruction? We can frequently what you get is a verbal instruction, and that is then backed up by a letter of instruction, maybe next day, a couple of days later, depending on whether it's during office hours, etc.
And usually that letter of instruction, the actual letter of instruction, will give you the terms of reference, what they are directing that we investigate. But out with office hours, or even during office hours, quite frequently we get a verbal instruction from Crown, and it will then be backed up by a letter.
So in terms of that paragraph, the responsibility for securing evidence and taking appropriate action in an Article 2 investigation remains with Police Scotland until effectively PIRC have had the call from Crown Office.
Yes.
Thank you. And then at that point, responsibility passes to PIRC.
Yes.
And then Police Scotland use of firearms. If we look at that, police use of a firearm can be defined as a discharge of a firearm, but it could also include taser or discharge of CS gas.
Yes. So you have conventional firearms and what may be considered conventional firearms. So that's guns, shotguns, etc. You've got taser, obviously, but it's an anomaly within the legislation. Again, CS gas, or PAVA as it is, falls within Section 5 of the Firearms Act 1968. It's the definition of what is a prohibited weapon, and it includes anything designed to discharge a noxious liquid. So potentially, whoever was drafting the legislation missed the fact that CS PAVA actually constitutes a firearm, and therefore all these get referred to PIRC. And I'm not aware of a similar requirement in England and Wales, unless, of course, there's further serious injury or death or whatever. So again, there's a slight anomaly within there. But certainly, discharge of a conventional firearm nearly always leads to investigation.
In terms of the events involving Mr. Bio in May 2015, we've heard evidence that there was a discharge of CS gas. Would that have meant that this document would be applicable in relation to the events at Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May?
I think the Crown instruction to investigate trumps any police referral. So the PIRC have instructed us to investigate a death. Consequently, the police need to refer discharge of CS gas. Falls into abeyance, really, because the Crown direction will include us investigating all aspects of what occurred, which will include the discharge of CS and PAVA.
And then if we look back to the top of the page, this says PIRC independent investigative processes following police use of firearms. Right at the top, please. The top of there we are. It's PIRC independent investigative processes after the police have used a firearm, which can include circumstances involving discharge of CS spray. When you mentioned it a moment ago, you said a Crown-led investigation trumps a referral.
Yes.
This doesn't seem to be restricted just to referrals. So would this document apply to either investigation, whether it's a Crown-led investigation or arising out of a police referral?
Yes, certainly. The way the legislation is framed is the police need to refer to PIRC all instances where firearms are used or discharged, and that includes CS PAVA. So that's a requirement in law. But the fact is, Crown have then instructed investigate the death, investigate all the circumstances. So you will examine automatically what's occurred, including the discharge of CS and PAVA. It's my opinion, and I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a lawyer, but there's still a requirement for Police Scotland to notify us that CS PAVA has been discharged. Now that did occur, because my understanding is that Keith Harrower got told on day one when he turned up that CS and PAVA had been used, so they did fulfil their legal obligation. The standard method is they actually commit that to paper and send us a form, which is usually completed by the officers that discharged it or their supervisor. But the legislation doesn't say you must fill out the paperwork or complete a form, just you must notify PIRC.
So, to go back to the first point, even if there hadn't been a discharge of CS spray in relation to Hayfield Road, the minute Crown said you have to investigate, that was the point at which PIRC would investigate regardless.
Yes.
Although it was still important it was still required for Police Scotland to intimate that CS spray had been discharged.
Yes.
And that was then told to Keith Harrower
Yes.
on the day. He became aware of that on the day. And that was sufficient to comply with their legal requirements under the legislation.
Yes, and usually when CS Pava has been discharged and we are investigating, we will ask that the CS or Pava canisters are then weighed. They should be weighed at the start of a shift to know how much liquid is within them, and if they're discharged, they should be then weighed following the discharge so that we can tell how much liquid has actually been used during the incident.
And we heard some evidence from Mr. Little about this, that also the canisters are allocated to individual officers.
Yes.
And I think, to summarise my understanding of his evidence, that then allows you to see who's used a canister that was attributed to them and how much liquid or spray was discharged from that canister.
Yes, but officers are based at police stations. Usually you have a cabinet at the police station that you're based in which is your CS Pava spray, and you have a key that unlocks it. And at the end of your shift you put it back into that cabinet. Part of the challenge is that, take for example, officers are getting drafted in from different divisions to assist Glasgow Policing Division. They might not start at their home station, therefore they might not get access to their own individual CS or Pava. They might need to be supplied with it at the station that they're attending, therefore there are spare supplies kept, so it's not always on an individual basis. It depends on the nature of the favourite one is football. You know, big games in either west of Scotland or east of Scotland, you might get officers drafted in from wherever to sorry, I keep doing that, my apologies.
Not at all.
To assist with the policing of that event. But the officers might be told, well, don't go to your home station, report to this station and start there, therefore they won't have access to their individual CS Pava.
But if they're given a CS spray to go to the football match, would there be normally a record kept of who's been given a CS spray?
There should be.
Should be.
I'm not certain it always occurs, but then I've not examined that.
Right. And so, in terms of gathering in evidence that might assist an investigation where there's been a discharge, the forms are only one element of evidence that could be recovered. There's the weighing and determination of has the spray been used, how much does it weigh now, how much does it weigh earlier, and what's the difference?
Yes.
So there's two different avenues of investigation open to PIRC, potentially there.
Yes. For example, I mean, each year there's usually 200 to 300 referrals of CS Pava. There's not a lot of investigation into them because it gets used most days. So.
Now, I wonder if you could just give me a moment,
Of course.
please. I wonder if it'd be possible to adjourn just slightly early, if that's possible.
Yes, certainly. We could stop now for a 20-minute break. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Just before the break, we were talking about discharge of CS spray. And you explained that there are different elements of evidence that might be available, both the weighing of the canister, the comparison with the records of what it weighed originally, how much liquid has been used, that type of thing.
Yeah.
But there was also the form, the
Yes.
forms that were completed. And you spoke about how on the 3rd of May, Keith Harrower was advised that CS spray had been discharged, or became aware that CS spray had been discharged.
Yes.
I'm interested in looking at that in a little bit more detail, if I may.
Of course.
We've heard evidence that police officers they can use force, but if they do use force operationally, that they must justify that.
Yes.
And that's in relation to every single use of force that is adopted. So that means, as we've heard evidence, if they strike a baton 3 times, they have to justify every individual strike of that baton. Is
Yes.
that right?
I think the one exception is handcuffing. So
Right.
handcuffing is effect to sometimes a use of force, but you don't need to report that.
Right, thank you. And we've heard that that use of force, in order to justify it and in order for that to be legal, it has to be reasonable and proportionate and necessary.
Yes.
And that we've also heard evidence about something called preclusion, where you have to use the absolute minimum force. So you have to have either ruled out a lower level of force before you adopt a higher level, or take the view that from the circumstances it wouldn't be worthwhile using that lower level of force.
That's
Is
correct.
that correct?
So sometimes that's a very quick process. That the officer could look at a set of circumstances and preclude everything apart from the option that they decide, and that can happen in a matter of seconds. But they've got to explain themselves and justify their actions.
And that justification has to be provided for that use of force to be deemed legal.
Yes, well, I'm not sure I would describe it as legal, but it's a requirement within Article 2 and within Article 3. If they overstep the mark, that could cross into criminality, in which case we'd be taking the matter to Crown.
And in terms of the completion of the form, is it right to say that there's actually more than one reason why those forms should be completed? One is formal notification in terms of the legislation.
Yes.
There's been use of an item, a spray, which is classified as a firearm.
Yes.
And so there has to be that notification to PIRC.
Yes.
And we've heard it's done through officer safety training and an email address that then comes to PIRC within 24 hours, I think.
Normally.
And the other element in terms of completing the form is to justify why that use of force was adopted, why that spray was discharged.
That's correct.
So in terms of the notification to Mr. Harrower on the 3rd of May, although there may have been notification or that he was advised that spray had been discharged, what about the justification part if the forms were not completed?
Yes, well, I think I would split that into 2 areas. So, legislative-wise, Police Scotland are required to notify us of the discharge of CS Pava. Then you've got the second element, which the officer themselves must justify why they considered it necessary, and we then look at necessity, proportionality, etc. So you've got the legal requirements in Police Scotland. Moving down below that level is the officer then must justify that.
So it's not for Police Scotland to create a justification, it's for the individual officer and it's their responsibility
Yes.
to provide justification,
Yes.
regardless of any notification requirements under the legislation.
Yes.
Thank you. And is that part of what you said before the break, that it could be a line manager or a supervisor who completes the form notifying PIRC of the
Yes.
discharge?
Equally, sometimes the supervisor may obtain the account from the officers and then commit that account onto the form. But you should have spoken to the officer and obtained the officer's thought processes as to why he considered the use of CS PAVA was necessary.
Necessary, reasonable and proportionate.
Yes. The vast majority of the officers themselves complete the forms. Occasionally you will get a supervisor or somebody else completing it, but that's rare, but it can happen.
We heard that there can be situations where the officer is injured or goes off duty immediately afterwards and isn't in a position to complete the form for some health reason.
Yes.
In that case, a supervisor can carry out the process themselves.
Yes, that's largely the circumstances I'm describing.
And now we heard evidence from Mr. Little that these forms can be gathered in by PIRC, and they're not just left in a filing cabinet somewhere, but actually there's a process that they go through in relation to PIRC in terms of assessing the justification that's provided. Is that
Yes.
correct?
It applies to all police referred matters to PIRC. They undergo that assessment process. There is a huge number of CS PAVA referrals to us. They greatly outweigh any other type of referral, but it does go through an assessment process. The more complex the incident, the greater the assessment. Sometimes you might decide to immediately, without probing the incident any further, as soon as the referral comes in, you think, no, this is quite a serious situation. We're moving straight to investigation without undertaking a detailed assessment for what you could be described as more minor matters. So if it's simply they've discharged CS PAVA to bring the person under control, they've justified that in the forum, you complete that assessment and you decide not to investigate. So there's a whole range of considerations when you're undertaking assessment.
And is that assessment essentially a preliminary view by PIRC in regard to whether it appears obviously a reasonable approach or there may be issues that require investigation?
Yes, and we've also got to bear in mind that PIRC are an oversight body of Police Scotland, so we will, even though we might consider that the actions were proportionate, reasonable, necessary, we will examine a random sample of these and investigate them to ensure that Police Scotland are and their officers are acting in accordance with policy and procedure. Because otherwise, if we don't investigate some of these, we're not necessarily performing the oversight function that we are set up to do.
So PIRC do not simply just take the forms at face value, they occasionally dig below the surface.
Yes. If we pick up something within their form when doing the assessment thinking, this doesn't sound quite right, we would move it to an investigation. But equally, we will randomly dip sample some of these and move them to investigation just to make sure that Police Scotland are ticking the right boxes, for want of a better expression.
Thank you. And I was also going to ask you about an incident which had taken place on the 18th of October 2014 in Victoria Hospital, where we understand there was a discharge of CS spray in the accident and emergency department. And we heard some evidence about this from Mr. Little.
Yes.
And he said there was a PIRC investigation into that discharge.
Yes.
And a report had been prepared and some recommendations were made. Do you know about that investigation?
Yes. I think Mr. Little, he was the lead investigator for that. I, as a supervisor, then quality controlled the report, so I was aware of the findings and recommendations.
Right. And do you remember what the recommendations were roughly in relation to that?
It was primarily surrounding record keeping within Fife Division of Police Scotland. The records were chaotic, for want of a better term. CS Pava wasn't regularly getting weighed, so you couldn't tell whether anybody had used it, how much they had used, etc. It was chaotic, and the recommendations were primarily, for want of a better expression, you need to get your house in order here. You need to, proper records, proper control.
When were Police Scotland advised about those recommendations? Do you remember?
I don't remember. When we issue findings and recommendations to Police Scotland, we usually ask that they report to PIRC within 3 months of receiving the report with the findings and recommendations as to what steps they have taken to implement them. Now, I can't remember when we issued the report in relation to the Victoria Hospital. What I do know is that it was, I think, potentially the November following the death of Mr. Bio that Police Scotland came back to PIRC to say how they had implemented the recommendations from the Victoria Hospital instance, so several months after the event.
And, well, if you take from me it was October 2014, that'd be just over a year after the event.
Yes.
Mr. Little talked about this, and he couldn't recall, but thought that perhaps the 3-month period would have gone beyond May 2015. Do you have any recollection of that?
No, I don't.
No, thank you. We were on the document from June 2014, and that was PIRC 04438. I'll just complete going through this at the moment. I won't go into the detail at this stage. Do we see on page 2 that there's, in relation to investigative processes, there's mention there of PIRC investigation at the scene. There's comments about geographical location and how quickly PIRC can arrive at the scene.
Yes.
There's reference here to the PIRC scene manager, and that a trained and experienced PIRC scene manager will be appointed. And did you have a PIRC trained and experienced scene managers in place in May 2015?
Yes.
Thank you. And then it talks about the initial actions to consider the circumstances and the consultation to be had. Thank you. And the PIRC senior investigator will produce a scene investigation strategy, which they'll deliver on behalf of the senior investigator.
Yes.
And the strategy will ensure the locus is photographed, video recorded, capturing all evidence in situ, where appropriate aerial and 360-degree photography should be utilised.
Yes.
And a scene entry log already in place with Police Scotland should be discontinued but held as a production. And then a PIRC scene entry log should be raised and maintained throughout the duration of the scene investigation.
Yeah.
And then if we move on to the next page, page 3, there's talk of cordons. There will be a uniform police presence to ensure the security of the outer cordon.
Yes.
Now, although we've heard evidence about the importance of independence, we've heard that in terms of scenes, often PIRC will have to rely on the support of Police Scotland officers, who may be uniformed officers,
Yes.
to secure and preserve the integrity of a scene. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think, looking at it logically, it's the sight of a uniformed police officer saying to somebody, sorry, this is taped off. As a member of the public, you cannot get in here. And that's difficult for PIRC investigators to do. We don't wear uniforms or whatever. A lot of times members of the public are completely unaware of who we are and what our functions are. and therefore that's primarily why you will use uniformed police officers on the cordon. And you've seen you've seen it in television. We've all seen it in television. You know, the blue and white tape things are cordoned off. So.
I mean, first of all, would you have the resources to allocate someone that task of ensuring nobody gets into the scene?
No.
Do you have any concerns about how this appears to the public when PIRC are involved in what should be an entirely independent investigation?
I think we've got to look at the practicalities, which is PIRC are a very small organisation. We're not funded or staffed to undertake a lot of these scenes, and I fully appreciate the what you would say is how it looks, the optics. I meant to. Sorry, I was trying to remember the word that was there. The optics. I fully understand the optics, but it's the practicalities that kick in these events.
And then it says the PIRC scene manager should liaise with the Police Scotland scene manager and establish what specialist forensic services have been requested by Police Scotland prior to PIRC's arrival. And again, is this what you were talking about earlier, identifying what specialist resources may be required? That may include forensic specialists.
Yes, invariably if you're going to photograph an incident scene, that'll be the Scottish Police Authority, SPA, Identification Bureau.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt. I wonder if somebody could just move the microphone down a bit. I think it's not quite picking you up. Try that now.
I think my lord was trying to avoid
I
punching
appreciate
it.
that,
So
but I think it's probably more important that we hear you rather than
My
I can live
apology.
with the difficulty with the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. And it says there, PIRC will have primacy in relation to the investigation into the shooting or the discharge of spray. Police Scotland may have a duty in relation to the scene in terms of another criminal offence, i.e. the person shot is concerned in firearms offences or has committed another crime at the scene. And I think that's what you touched on before the break, where you talked about a scenario where in relation to the Glasgow shooting, the person had allegedly stabbed 5 individuals prior to the police using force and
Yes.
shooting that person. And I think, as I understand your evidence, you said PIRC investigate the use of force by the officers, but the 5 stabbings would remain within the purview of the police.
yes, but certainly when we're reporting the incident to Crown, you're trying to put context around why did the police use lethal force. So while the police are investigating the initial instance, the 5 stabbings, we've obtained details from Police Scotland of those incidents because it's like a continuous sequence of events. You can't just start at this point, which is, why did you shoot him? Well, we shot him because the sequence of events that occurred before that. So there's an exchange of information frequently between Police Scotland and PIRC. Sometimes in relation to that incident, I think we figured out some of the attacks were targeted attacks, but Police Scotland were not aware of that. So it's the exchange of information because it is a continuous sequence of events. And if we're both reporting separately to Crown, but drawing a line and saying, well, that's us, that's Police Scotland, it's then more difficult to understand the totality of what's occurred. So that's why there's an information exchange.
So you're avoiding a sort of artificial separation of events when they're linked.
Yes.
Thank you. And then at the bottom of the page, we see PIRC Productions officer or officers should seize and accurately record and label all productions from the scene as directed by the scene manager. A PIRC investigator performing the role of scribe will shadow the senior investigator and record all requests and instructions made by the senior investigator, capturing the time and date, details of the person requested, instructed, and any reply or comment made in response to the request or instruction.
Yes.
And we've heard evidence from Mr. Little that he's, in his role as lead investigator, he may be very busy, there's a lot happening, but the scribe will note down what's happening as it takes place. Is that the role?
Yes. That's the ideal situation, which is you take somebody with you. If you're the lead investigator, you've got all sorts of considerations. You're talking to a lot of different people, and therefore you want somebody with you that's going to take notes. That's the ideal scenario. Frequently it does occur. Occasionally it might not occur. And I've been to an incident where I was the first person there, and it took 2 or 3 hours for the rest of my staff to arrive. So you do your best.
And in that situation, why were you the first person to arrive and the team didn't arrive for 2 or 3 hours?
Well, what had happened was I had finished and was on the motorway passing Glasgow Airport when I got the phone call saying we've just shot somebody in Inverness. Now, we work 8 to 4, therefore all the staff had went home. So I'm phoning Crown. Crown are saying, in this instance I said to Crown, do you want to instruct? And they said, no, we don't, therefore I'll take it as a police referral. Phoning the office and saying, right, get the staff back into the office, because they're all headed home. And what I did was simply turned around and drove straight up to Inverness. Of course, they've got to get back into the office, get all their kit, their notebooks, all this sort of stuff, load up the cars and then drive to Inverness. So effectively I was on the road already, whereas they would have to come back in. So that's why I would arrive 2 or 3 hours before them.
Did you not feel the need to go back to the office and brief staff or pick up kit?
It was the practicalities, because those of you are familiar with Glasgow, the Kingston Bridge during the rush hour is, for want of a better expression, a nightmare. Therefore, I headed over the Erskine Bridge and cut across country, because otherwise it might have taken me 90 minutes to get back to the office, adding additional delays. So it's just, again, it was just the practicalities.
So on that occasion, you arrived first on your own.
Yes.
There was no scribe, there was no team with you.
No.
But you were able to go to the scene and take charge at that point.
Yes.
And that was a decision that you made based on practicalities as well as anything else.
Yes.
Did that hinder your team, the fact that you'd not met them at the office and given them a briefing in advance?
No, obviously I've got hands free in the car, so I could phone and describe a set of circumstances that was getting relayed to me, because I was getting phone calls from various people within Police Scotland, including the appointed post-incident manager, and I would then relay that information to the team that were coming out, so that they were briefed on the circumstances, so that they could hit the ground running as they arrived.
And did you find that telephone communication with your team adequate for the purpose?
Yes, there's always, as they arrive, depends when your last communication you had with them. The last communication you'd had with them, for example, was an hour before, and you'd been tied up doing things. You would want to update them as to what's happened within the last hour, and then get them assigned to their duties.
Then looking at PIRC investigation at the PIM suite, post-incident management suite, is this an example of what you were saying earlier about the terms being interchangeable?
Yes.
The PIRC senior investigator attending at the scene will deploy a post-incident management aware member of the PIRC staff to the Police Scotland post-incident management suite. And was this also what you were talking about earlier, where someone who's maybe had awareness training will be appointed, although they may not be a post-incident manager qualified PIM? Yes,
because I think we need to remember that PIP or PIM is a police process. It's got a dual purpose. There is an investigative element of it, and there's also the welfare element of it. So it's very much a police process. So certainly we need to understand from our perspective the 4 stages within that process. Equally, There are certain functions that we will want to oversee. So if firearms are discharged, we will want to oversee and video record what's called the count back. So unload your weapon, drop your weapon, or drop the magazine out of the weapon, count how many bullets are in, how many bullets did you start with, how many bullets are left in it. Does that equate with the number of shots fired? So there's quite a lot within that to oversee. So it's not just the 4 stages. Equally, you might be seizing clothing, etc. Now, it's not necessarily what you think, because you're not seizing a firearms officer's clothing for firearms deposit residue, because their clothing has that on all day, every day. But sometimes it can be to confirm the actions of the officers. So police firearms officers are trained that if they shoot somebody, they will immediately go forward and render first aid. So there might be a transference of blood, and they might tell you, yes, I went forward and I gave first aid. You examine the clothing, there's blood in the clothing, that matches their account, and therefore supports their account of events. So there's quite a lot of complexities within these and considerations. Not all of them apply to every set of circumstances. It just depends. Each one's unique.
And the post-incident manager or post-incident management aware investigator will also be ascribed a scribe. Ideally, a PIRC investigator scribe will shadow and record all requests, instructions, timed and dated, made by the PIRC PIM aware investigator.
Yes, dependent on the nature of the incident, there's usually 2 PIRC staff go. Somebody that's PIM aware and somebody to support them. In large-scale incidents, we can be deploying 4, 5, 6 staff to an individual PIP suite. We have had an instance where there's been 3 different PIP suites dotted across the country, and we're sending staff to each of them to oversee that. So it can quickly eat up resources, but we do need to go and we do need to oversee it, and at least 2 staff go to each one. In more complex incidents, I think I touched on before the break, we've had an incident with 53 key police witnesses, so that's quite a large amount of people to manage, and with different post-incident suites.
Okay. And it says the PIRC scene manager or production officer or officers will also attend at the PIM suite and seize any firearms or production identified as relevant, and then identifies the 6 PIM suites that are available around the country.
There's dedicated PIM suites. These are the dedicated PIM suites, but a PIM suite can be held in any police office where it's feasible. So, for example, something happens in Thurso, you're not removing officers to Inverness, you know, because it's 3 hours northwards. So the PIM suite, if the incident happened in Thurso, the PIM suite might be in Thurso. We have had a death in custody in Elgin. The PIM suite was held in Elgin. Again, ideal, you're going to a dedicated PIM suite, but the geography of Scotland sometimes precludes that.
Right. I think we've heard that the officers were gathered in Kirkcaldy Police Office after Mr. Mayo died.
Yes.
And that was in the canteen area.
Yes.
Yeah. And is that the type of larger space that can be used to accommodate a PIM suite?
Yes. Usually it's one large room. The dedicated PIM suites have several rooms because also you need office accommodation for the post-incident manager from Police Scotland and their staff. If we turn up, we're going to want office accommodation as well. So the room itself might be where the principal officers are sat, but we'll need to use additional offices just to manage whatever we're doing.
Thank you. And then if we look at the final page, it talks about conferring, but officers not conferring with each other, which you've already spoken about. It's on the last page. If there's a need to confer in order to ensure transparency and maintain public confidence, this must be documented, including time, date, place, issues discussed, by whom, and the reason. and the Police Scotland PIM manager should have reminded the officers involved in relation to conferring. And then there's a section at the bottom called minimum deployment of PIRC personnel, and it's split into scene and PIM suite. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says senior investigating officer, scribe, scene manager, and 2 production officers. That would be 5 individuals.
That's the ideal.
Right, yeah.
Equally, if you've got multiple scenes, you know, you're going to have multiple deployments.
Right. So there could be more than that, but that says is minimum deployment in relation to the scene.
Yes, when we're talking scene here, we're talking about the general location, not necessarily to the exact scene of the incident, although the scene managers and production officers might be going directly there. The PIRC lead investigator might be going to the police office to find out what's happened.
So if we've heard that there were officers in Kirkcaldy Police Office and PIRC investigators went there,
Yes.
but there was also a scene at Hayfield Road,
Yes.
that wouldn't necessarily require this minimum number of officers
No.
to be at both locations.
I think Gary Sinclair was the person deployed to Hayfield Road as the PIRC scene manager, and John Ferguson, who sadly is no longer with us, was deployed to Victoria Hospital.
And the senior investigating officer, is that effectively a lead investigator?
Yes. A lot of times the terminology changes. It's like you've got a lead investigator, you've got a senior investigating officer, you've got an initial investigating officer. Broadly, they're all the same person, but just sometimes the nomenclature slightly changes. But for PIRC, it's either a lead investigator or a senior investigator, and it's not always the person with the title of senior investigator. They are the senior investigator for that investigation.
So you may be within PIRC's hierarchy a senior investigator, you may be a deputy senior investigator or simply an investigator, but you may be appointed as a lead investigator in relation to an incident.
Yes.
And then the second element there, minimum deployment, relates to the PIM suite. Now, we've heard from a PIM manager, Conrad Trickett,
Yes.
about events in May of 2015, and he said that if you are a suspect, you are removed from PIP.
Yes.
Was that correct?
That's correct.
So PIP or PIM or PIM suite, that would contain people who were witnesses,
Yes.
officers who may have witnessed an event,
Yes.
but not suspects.
Certainly not.
And the minimum deployment for that area would be a PIM-aware investigator, a scribe, a scene manager and a productions officer. So that's 4 individual roles.
That's the ideal. There have been instances where you don't need 4 people, you only require 2 people. So, for example, all incidents are managed by control rooms. We've heard about area control rooms within the police. But the staff within the area control room that managed the incident, they could be seen as key police witnesses. Now, there's no need for forensic examination or anything like that. You'll pick up the airwaves radio traffic later. So you might only need to send 2 people to the control room where that PIP has been held. And that's frequently why you have multiple PIPs, because you have the control room controlling the incident. I think for Mr Bio's death, the incident was controlled at Bilston Glen, which is in Edinburgh, whereas you've got the incident in Kirkcaldy, so you might have 2 separate PIP suites. There have been times when we've had 3 separate PIP suites, 1 for the control room, 1 for the location, and then there's been actions by other officers at a distance from it. Therefore, there's been 3 post-incident processes run.
If you only have one PIM suite and one scene, would you agree that this is the minimum deployment
Yes.
in relation to PIRC personnel?
Yes. And that's usually what we do. We'll evaluate it, so if there's been a discharge of firearms, we will send 4 to that PIP suite. But equally, that incident's been controlled by the control room, we'll send 2 additional staff to that location.
That's if
so-
there's 2 PIM suites.
Yes,
So that, looking just at that page of minimum deployment, that would be a total of 9 roles, 9 personnel,
yes,
and that would be the minimum deployment that would normally be sent.
that's ideal.
Thank you. Now, we've heard from Mr. Harrower and we've heard from Mr. Little that Mr. Harrower was lead investigator on the 3rd of May 2015.
Yes,
Mr. Little took over on the 4th of May,
yes,
and then that you became involved on Tuesday the 5th of May.
yes,
So from your statement, I understand, you arrived on duty at 8 o'clock on the 5th of May 2015, and that's when you learned about the incident.
yes.
You hadn't been personally involved in the events on the 3rd or the 4th.
No, so the 3rd was the Sunday, the 4th was the Monday, but that was the May Day public holiday, so I was off that day.
Right. And when did you first hear about the death of Mr. Bile? Was it on arrival on the 5th of May?
Yes. I think I'd actually been away with my wife on the 4th, so I didn't pick up on it until I went into my work on the 5th.
And the 5th was the Tuesday.
Yes,
And we've heard that at that time, Mr. Harrower and Mr. Little were deputy senior investigators in PIRC,
yes,
but appointed as lead investigators. And we've heard that at that time, you were a senior investigator and you
Yes.
came in on the Tuesday.
yes,
And I'd just like to ask you a little bit about your role on the Tuesday, because before Mr. Little came in, we understood you were appointed lead investigator on the Tuesday. But Mr. Little said that initially he remained in that role. You came in with oversight, but it then evolved and you were effectively the lead and he was your deputy. I'd like to hear your explanation of your role on the Tuesday.
I think initially, so on the Monday, Billy was appointed as lead investigator. I came in on the Tuesday and was told, right, provide oversight and assistance to Billy. As the complexities very rapidly developed, it was then decided, right, I'm now the senior investigator and Billy is my deputy. When precisely that happened, I can't say now, but it did happen fairly rapidly.
And Mr. Little wasn't able to remember a precise moment in time when you became the lead and he took the role of your deputy. When you say fairly rapidly, can you help the chair understand when that role evolved, that you were the lead?
Yeah, I think it was shortly after the 5th. It didn't happen in the 5th because I think you'll see from my policy log that at some point I've recorded Mr. Little as the lead investigator with me as the backup. So it would have been after the 5th because otherwise I wouldn't have recorded that in paper. So it's probably from the 6th. In fact, it was, I'm quite certain it was the 6th. And the reason why I say that is because I then decided to go through to Fife to meet, along with Billy, to meet with DCI Keith Hardy to do with approaching the 9 principal officers. So I'm fairly certain it was the 6th. That's why I say it quite rapidly evolved into that.
And in terms of the practicalities of that role which you had, did you change your approach from having oversight on the 5th to when you became lead investigator? And if so, can you explain how you did that?
No, most of the 5th was taken up in understanding exactly what had happened, getting the instant room, the PIRC instant room up and running, allocating roles and responsibilities. Some of those had already occurred on the 3rd and the 4th. But getting an understanding of exactly what happened, and there's also quite a lot of information coming in during that sort of period. Some of it conflicting, some of it erroneous, so you're trying to understand exactly the nature of the instance. So for me in day 1, you're getting briefings from staff, you're reading briefing papers, and I know you've examined Keith's briefing paper, and you're getting a good understanding. You're also, myself and Billy are talking all the time, because it still is very early doors in the investigation, and we're just agreeing priorities, and really when you get an inquiry of this magnitude, really the lead investigator, the senior investigator, takes responsibility for policies and strategies, with the deputy then converting them into practical actions for staff then to go out and undertake that to complete this, what your policies and strategies are. But you work seamlessly because you're talking all the time. And equally, if one of you goes off on holiday for a week, the other's got to be able to take over. You don't leave a gap. So there's a really close relationship between the senior investigator and their deputy, because that needs to occur. And that occurs whether it's within PIRC, it occurs within the police, it occurs within other agencies.
I'd like, you've mentioned the policy, and there was a policy log. I would like to come on to that in a moment. But before I do so, can I ask you some questions about focus towards the independence of the inquiry? I think in your statement, you said that you knew some of the officers who were involved in the investigation into the death of Mr. Bio.
Yes.
Of police officers from Police Scotland.
Yes.
And I'd like to ask you particularly about those. You've said that you knew Pat Campbell. We've heard he was the SIO.
Yes.
And you knew ACC Nicholson, who
Yes.
was the Gold Commander.
Yes.
And you said in your statement you had no relationship with them in May 2015, but I wonder if you could just explain in a little more detail how you knew them and what your relationship had been
Yes.
before.
So, starting with Pat Campbell, I worked in intelligence at Force Headquarters. Pat Campbell worked in CID operations. I was a detective superintendent in CID intelligence. In special operations, he was a detective sergeant at headquarters. So I knew that he worked at headquarters. I would occasionally pass him in a corridor, but I never worked alongside him. And in respect to the Bio inquiry, I had no contact with him throughout the duration of the Bio investigation, no contact at all. Moving on to Mr. Nicholson, when I was Detective Superintendent down in Ayrshire Division, Mr. Nicholson was my line manager. So he was the Detective Chief Superintendent, and he line managed the Detective Superintendents in each of the geographical divisions. So I certainly knew him, but when I moved on to the intelligence side, I then had a different line manager. Now, again, I had no contact with Mr. Nicholson throughout the duration of the Bio inquiry, so I did not see those as potential conflicts. I knew of them. I explained my relationship to them, but I didn't see any conflict there.
Can I ask you a little more about your contact or relationship with ACC Nicholson?
Yes.
You said that he was your line manager. How many other detective superintendents did he line manage at that time?
At that time, there was, I think there was 12 territorial divisions within Strathclyde, and each had a detective superintendent as in charge of the CID for that division. It was slightly unique insofar as the detective superintendents in the division didn't answer to the division or the divisional commander. They answered to the detective chief superintendent CID operations, who was Mr. Nicholson. So he was managing them. There were also 2 or 3 specialist detective superintendents in charge of specialist areas. So, for example, at one point in time, the detective super in charge of the fraud squad. So they would be managed within CID operations and maybe answerable to the detective chief superintendent CID operations.
So when you were working in the air, how regularly did you have discussions or meetings or contact with Nicholson?
Usually you would have, at the very least, weekly contact. If you were the on-call detective superintendent, you would come out at the weekend and you would then brief Mr. Nicholson on what had occurred over the weekend. Equally, you went down and you briefed the command team as to serious incidents that occurred over the weekend. So you would have fairly regular contact with him.
And how long were you in air with this regular contact with ACC Nicholson?
I think it was there for about 6 months, and then I transferred up to special operations, and that moved me away from his line management.
And I think we were looking at your career earlier. When exactly did you move to special operations of Special Branch? Was this 2000 or was it a different time?
So I was a DCI in Special Branch Special Operations. So that's covert investigations into terrorism, organised crime and support to murder investigations. On return from Africa, I was then appointed Detective Superintendent in Ayrshire Division. Spent about 6 months there, and then was transferred back to what you could call covert operations or covert specialist operations. Again, examining terrorist matters, organised crime, support to murder investigations, and I had various areas of business, some of them quite sensitive areas of business.
I think from your statement, you told us that you'd returned from Sierra Leone in 2006, and it was after that you were promoted and moved to air, is that
Yes.
correct? And you spent 6 months with ACC Nicholson as your line manager.
Yes.
And how long did you spend in air? Was that the 6-month period?
Yes.
So this was sometime after 2006?
Probably during 2006.
2006. And did you have any contact with ACC Nicholson after you moved and you were promoted?
Yes, you would see them on a regular basis. Not so much to discuss business, because we were in 2 very different business areas. I worked on the secret and covert side of policing, dealing with quite sensitive matters. But I would see him on a regular basis because it was headquarters, and his office was probably at the other end of the corridor from where my office was.
And as well as seeing him in the building, did you have actual contact with him during that period?
Occasionally, because if the operational arm of CID required assistance in respect of targeting organised crime groups or murder inquiries, and we're now dealing with highly sensitive matters, so if they required assistance, they would approach me for such assistance.
But you no longer had line management responsibility
No.
towards you?
And I was also the authorising officer at one time for a lot of the covert activity under was RIPA and RIPS. It's now the Investigatory Powers Act. Although the highly sensitive material required to go to the Chief Constable, but I then acted as effectively the scribe for the Chief Constable, and it then went to the Surveillance Commissioners, now the Interception and Communications Commissioner, for authorisation. So therefore, Mr Nicholson or one of the other detective supers might say, look, we're hitting a brick wall with this investigation. We need covert and sensitive assets deployed, so they would seek such assistance. And if you considered it necessary and proportionate, you would facilitate that.
When did your contact with ACC Nicholson come to an end? That's
Sorry.
That's all right. Sorry, don't worry. When did your contact with ACC Nicholson come to an end?
Probably when I retired from the police, because we worked in the same building, we worked in the same corridor, although they're on one side of the building, we're on the other side of the building, but
So
you would see him and you pass him on a regular basis.
Is that about 2012?
Probably.
And so by 2015, between 2012 and 2015, had you had any contact with ACC Nicholson at all?
Not that I recall, I don't think so.
And we've heard evidence that there was a process, a code of conduct in PIRC, and a process where if you were concerned about any possible conflict, you could declare a knowledge of someone or an awareness or a familiarity or a relationship.
Yes.
Did you feel in 2015 that you should declare your prior knowledge and awareness and contact with ACC Nicholson or not?
No, because I had no contact with Mr Nicholson during the bio-inquiry, therefore I didn't consider there was a conflict.
Right, thank you. I'd like to move on and look at your log that you've already mentioned.
Yes, ma'am.
Can we look at a typed version first? The policy log PIRC 04153. Now we've looked at this document with Mr Little in evidence, and it's a policy log which is, as I understand it, a typed version of a handwritten log that you would have prepared.
Yes.
And so Mr Little said you were the author of the policy log, is that right?
That's correct.
And you commenced that on the 5th of May 2015.
Yes.
And this is a typed version of it. I'm actually going to go through the detailed handwritten version with you today, but we can see from this document on the face of it, the incident is the 3rd of May. The senior investigating officer is named as DSI William Little, who is a deputy senior investigator.
Yes.
The deputy investigating officer is given as you, John McSporran, who is a senior investigator.
Yeah, I think that's what we touched on a short while ago, that sort of flipped on the Tuesday. On the Wednesday, which is the 6th. So when I initially committed this to paper, the front page is these roles and responsibilities, but that quickly flipped on the next day.
So on the Tuesday the 5th, you're listed as the deputy to
Yes.
Mr Little, who is the lead investigator. The following day that flipped, and you essentially took the lead from
Yes.
the 6th of May. And you also mentioned earlier that you were appointed to take oversight. And I'm interested in this a relationship between someone who's listed as both the deputy who also has oversight. Can you explain that, please?
I think it's just an anomaly because I had to record somewhere that I was involved, and there's no mechanism because it's quite prescriptive describing the roles here. There's no role for oversight or overseer. Therefore, the best way I thought I could record that I was involved was by putting myself down as the deputy. That was on the 5th. And it's a simple matter of, to a certain extent, transparency to show that I was involved.
This role of having oversight, regardless of what's on that page, what did that role involve? Did you understand the nature of that role?
I think it was to support and assist Billy Little. But as I say, that quickly evolved the next day. And we don't really have anybody since then appointed as overseer. You do have, in my role as head of investigations for PIRC, you will have oversight of all the ongoing investigations and the reports. But that doesn't make you the overseer in respect of any of the specific investigations. So I think it was more an anomaly in respect of this one, where it was like, John, you have oversight, you help Billy. And come my day two, which was the 6th, that flipped. So John, you're now the lead investigator, Billy, you're the deputy.
And who was it that ultimately took that decision to make you lead?
I think it was Mr. Mitchell.
Now, from perhaps a slightly different perspective, from someone outside PIRC, someone with the role of having oversight may be viewed as someone who is sitting above the lead investigator and perhaps checking things are done properly, or where things are being missed or not being done properly, they could perhaps direct a different direction in relation to an investigation. Is that any part of having oversight?
I would say yes, considering what you're saying just now. But equally, when you're the senior investigating officer, you're checking the statements, you're checking who's doing what, all that sort of stuff. So there's a degree of oversight there of the investigation. You are the senior investigating officer, you are overseeing that investigation. You're directing, you're creating policies, strategies. You're interacting with the deputy senior investigator, who's translating a lot of that into actions. Staff go out, they complete the action, take a statement, get productions, get documents, whatever. That's brought in, gets recorded within the investigation, and you're examining that and you're reading a lot of things, so that you're as aware as possible of everything that's going on. Equally, you can get information overload, so sometimes the best way to gain an understanding is just to have staff brief you, or you have a daily briefing where staff impart to you and the deputy the relevant and salient points from their actions the day before, rather than going chapter and verse as to what's occurred. It's like, tell me the important stuff that I need to know here. I'll catch up in the reading when I get the opportunity.
So regardless of your PIRC title or what's said here, am I correct in saying that you had a contribution to make to this investigation and you had influence over the direction of the investigation?
Yes.
Thank you. Let's look at just the other names mentioned. We've heard that who's listed as office manager, Ian McIntyre, we were told he was one of 3 staff involved in the major incident room,
Yes.
if I can put it that way. And productions officer, we've heard, you've mentioned Gary Sinclair, who was allocated the role of scene manager for Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And he was also involved in other matters as well.
Yes.
And then other relevant staff included yourself, John Ferguson, who was also a qualified scene manager. Family liaison involved Alistair Lewis and John Clarkin.
Yes.
But we've heard from Mr. Little that there were a large number of members of the PIRC team who were involved, and in fact all bar one were actively involved in this investigation.
Yes, and I think we need to remember at that time we had a total of 22 people. This was a large-scale investigation, and it was very quickly becoming a large-scale investigation. Now, I've run murder inquiries where I've had 50 or 60 staff, and this was going to be a highly complex thing, and we had to manage this with effectively 20 deployable staff. So staff are multitasking. Some are doing crime scene management. Then as soon as they complete that, they'll move on to another role. I mean, quite apart from, and I think we've touched on it, Gary Sinclair being crime scene manager responsible for productions in day one. Later on, he became the interview advisor when he was drawing up the interview for the interview of the 9 principal officers. So sometimes they're performing multiple roles.
You've mentioned this in your inquiry statement, but what were your views about the resources available to you in this investigation in relation to Mr. Bio's death, and the adequacy of those resources at that time?
I don't want to stray into the political sphere.
Right.
I don't consider that we were effectively funded or resourced to undertake the functions. I think probably Miss Frame might have more to say in that, but I don't want to stray into the political sphere.
But from your looking back now,
Yeah.
and from your experience of dealing with murder investigations, deaths in custody, deaths following police contact, solely leaving aside political issues, but solely in relation to the numbers that you had available to conduct this investigation, do you feel you had adequate resources available to PIRC at that time?
At that time, no. Now, what I will add to that is that following the investigation into the death of Mr. Bio and the investigation into the M9, the death crash in the M9, application was made saying we are stretched here, we need additional funding, we need additional resourcing, and that was forthcoming. But I think it took the Bio investigation and the M9 crash and our ever-increasing workload to demonstrate that we were under-resourced and underfunded. Because potentially, this is a personal opinion now, there should have been more of a scoping exercise undertaken by government to measure the scale of the task that PIRC would have to undertake, and that scoping exercise should then have been used to identify how much funding and resourcing would be required. Now, I am not sure whether that occurred, or what level it occurred, or what detail it occurred.
Thinking about the resourcing, we've heard there were 22 members of staff from top to bottom.
Yes.
That Mr. Little on the 4th came in and had all bar one working on this inquiry. He still required the support of Police Scotland,
Yes.
particularly in relation to issues regarding house-to-house inquiries. And
What I would say there is that, I think as we're aware and we've discussed, on the Sunday the 3rd, PIRC were simply instructed to investigate the incident at Hayfield Road and the aftermath of that, whereas Police Scotland were investigating all the events leading up to the incident at Hayfield Road. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Can you repeat the question?
I was talking about resourcing
Yeah.
and the adequacy of resourcing, and talking about some of the evidence we've heard from Mr. Little, talking about how he used all but one of the PIRC resources and staff he had at his disposal
Yes.
on the 4th when he came in. But in addition, he talked about still requiring to rely on support from Police Scotland. And one of the matters I mentioned was the house-to-house.
Yes, well, I think because of the preceding incidents, Police Scotland were doing that house-to-house inquiry. So, as we know, Mr. Bio had been in the house of Mr. Dick in the early hours of Sunday the 3rd. So he then left there and returned to his own house. was an altercation outside with his friend, Mr. Said. He then left that house and then walked along various roads until he arrived at Hayfield Road in Kirkcaldy. So we were doing Hayfield Road, the immediate nature of Hayfield Road, including house to house. Police Scotland were doing all the other house to house because that's what they had to investigate. Now that changed on the 5th, where basically Crown said, just do everything, take over all aspects. Sorry, I'm punching that again. Take over all aspects. At which point we told Police Scotland, stop the house to house. We are now taking over all aspects of the house to house. But they'd already done some of that anyway. Fine, they'd done it. We would examine what they'd done. If we felt it necessary to go back and see somebody, then we would do that.
So thinking about the resources that were available to PIRC that first week, approximately 21 members of staff were available. You said you took the view that you were not adequately resourced. Can you help the Chair understand where you felt there was perhaps a shortfall or further resources would have benefited PIRC at that time?
Where you have limited resources, I think there's a difference between an effective investigation and the timeliness of the investigation, because you can be effective with limited resources, but it might take you longer to get there, and therefore the limitation on resources will delay the investigation and what can be achieved within timescales. And part of the challenge, as we know, if we go back to the 5 principles, was promptness. And if you have limited resources, it delays things, adds to frustration, not just within the organisation, but it leads to frustration by, for example, the family of the deceased, who consider, well, things aren't progressing as quickly as we would like. Well, you're doing your best with the resources you have. But if those resources are limited, there's a limit. I know I've used the word limited and limit twice there, but there's a limit in what can be achieved within reasonable timescales.
And looking back now at that early week, those early days, can you identify in your mind areas where you simply didn't have any more staff to do a task you would have liked to have been done?
I think as the days went on, staff began to multitask. So we are sending out actions, right, let's complete the house to house. Let's get this, you're prioritising what you're doing, right. We want the house to house completed as quickly as possible. So it was at that point, I think Billy Little touched upon it, I'm saying, I need additional resources here. I have ran out of staff. And I went to the Commissioner and she said, shut down the review section in PIRC, that's the other side of our business, complaint handling reviews, get out and help the investigations team. Let's complete the house to house at the very least. So they assisted us with that to complete that aspect, because that was quite important, because during the house to house you were turning up witnesses who had seen, or you were identifying witnesses. I use a lot of colloquialisms, turning up witnesses, but you were identifying witnesses who had seen aspects of it and required statements taken. Equally, it's a thing that which frequently occurs during murder investigations or other things. You get the revisit of the screen of the scene precisely 1 week later. So I organised the revisit to the scene 1 week later to see if, because this occurred 7:20 on the Sunday morning, so we would go there from about 7:15 in that morning through to the back of 8 and see, we would stop vehicles with the assistance of the traffic department or roads policing and Police Scotland, stop vehicles. And that actually threw up a couple of additional witnesses that had never come forward in the first instance. So, but because you're doing that, as you're speaking to people, you require staff to take them aside. Who are they? what did they see, get statements from them, sometimes arrange, well, you can't give a statement just now because you're on your way to work, because the hospital was very close by and there was a changeover of shift. So you're making arrangements to go back and see them in the evening. Or there's all these things to consider.
When was it that you spoke to, was it Miss Scullion, and she directed, let's shut down the complaint handling section and use those staff as well?
It was Miss Frame, who was the commissioner.
Miss Frame, sorry.
I think that was within 2 or 3 days, because I know I had those resources by the Sunday, which was the week later, and the priority was completing the house to house. So I knew I had those resources come that weekend. Now, those staff did not work at weekends, therefore I must have had them prior to the weekend. So
you come back to work on Tuesday the 5th.
Yes.
You've got additional resources at your disposal prior to the weekend. Would that be by the Friday?
Potentially, yes.
The 8th?
Yeah. But I think what we need to remember is that none of those staff were trained investigators. They had an entirely different function within PIRC. But equally, legislative-wise, PIRC investigators have the powers of a constable. Other PIRC staff don't. So they didn't have the powers of a constable because you are designated by the Commissioner. And if you ever look at a PIRC ID, on the back of it there's a statement that states the legislation and confers the powers of a constable on you. So investigators, while doing the investigation on behalf of the Commissioner, have the powers of a constable. Other PIRC staff don't. So
did that then limit the roles or the tasks they could be allocated?
Yes, certainly, because you wouldn't allocate them a task to undertake by themselves. Because usually you work in pairs for corroboration, what you would do is then split the investigators and actually give them a member of the review staff to act as their corroborating person. And that's how we did it. But we didn't individually allocate actions for them to go out and complete. They were there to assist primarily from the corroboration perspective.
I see. Thank you. Can we turn now to the actual handwritten document? Now, I'm going to go through this and it'll be on the screen, and we'll be able to go through it in that sense. You won't have the ability to flick through pages doing it this way, but if there is another page you'd like to see, we can hopefully work through that, and I've got a hard copy myself.
Yes, ma'am.
So this is, as you can see it on the screen, PIRC 04154, and it says management policy file at the top, and we see handwriting. Is that your handwriting?
Yes.
And it gives the date of crime, incident 3rd of May 2015, and Mr. Little's name's there and your own name's there. And we see this is, we saw the typed version a moment ago. Is this effectively what it was typed from?
Yes, and I started completing this on the 5th, and that's why you've got the anomaly where basically Billy and me flip roles come the 6th. So, right. But I'd started writing this on the 5th.
And tell us, what is a management policy file? What's it for?
It's to basically manage the investigation from a strategy and a policy perspective. All major investigations usually have a management policy file, and it's to record your high-level decisions, setting out the progress of the investigation in a structured way, your thought processes, why are we doing this? Now that translates into a series of actions. So for example, you might have a forensic strategy. You would record your forensic strategy, and then that gets converted into a series of actions by staff, which is go out, seize production, submit them to a lab, get examinations done. So it's quite high level sort of policy and strategy. It's not a series of actions, but equally it's to chart the development of the investigation and record what's your considerations, what are your reasons sometimes for taking the investigation in this direction or whatever. So it's quite a high level document. Now all senior investigating officers, whether they be in the police, PIRC or wherever, are trained in management policy files.
In terms of the person, we obviously know that this is your document and you started it and created it. What role would normally be responsible for creating and starting a management policy file?
It's usually the senior investigator or senior investigating officer within the police.
Now, would that be like the lead investigator in PIRC or someone with the title senior investigating
Yes.
officer?
But you usually only have a management policy file for those large-scale investigations. You don't have them for smaller investigations, only for large-scale investigations. Within the police, that's primarily murders or major inquiries. Let's say a terrorist investigation, a terrorist incident would be quite high level. But for more general crime, you certainly wouldn't do that. And within PIRC, it's for the large-scale investigations.
Thank you. That sets us up for this afternoon, but I'm conscious of the time. Would that be an appropriate moment to rise?
We'll stop for lunch now and sit at 2 o'clock.